Okay, so like imagine this. It's 1773 Boston Harbor, right? And you've got these colonists all disguised about to do the Boston Tea Party. Talk about an act of defiance. But it makes you think, doesn't it? Like, fast forward to today, with all the facial recognition tech and digital footprints we leave everywhere, could those colonists even pull that off now?
Probably not. I mean, you
Yeah.
can barely go to the grocery store these days without being on camera. It's wild. And it leads to some really interesting questions like, what happens to protest and anonymity in a world of constant
Right.
surveillance?
Like, think about mask bans at protests. Do they even work? Or are we just creating more problems by trying to control who covers their face?
Yeah, it's a tangled web, for sure. And that's what we're going to be diving into today, looking at this whole mask ban debate from a few different angles. We've got this article from Wired magazine, The Real Problem with Banning Masks at Protests, which lays out some of the main arguments.
And we've also got this statement from the CDC, which adds another layer to the whole thing.
Exactly. So whether you're super politically active or just kind of curious about how technology is changing the game, this deep dive's for you. Because we're talking about free speech and security in the digital age.
Stuff that affects all of us. Okay, so let's start with like, why do these mask bans even exist? What's the logic behind them?
Well, it's all about accountability. At least that's the argument Hannah Myers from the Manhattan Institute makes. She says if you can't identify someone, how can you hold them responsible for any crimes they might commit at a protest?
Makes sense on the surface, right? You do something illegal, you shouldn't be able to hide.
Right. And there's this whole idea that anonymity, like, emboldens people, gives them this shield to act in ways they wouldn't if everyone knew who they were.
Kind of like mob mentality, but with masks.
Exactly. Myers even suggests that mask bans could actually make protests safer. The idea being if people know they can be identified, they're less likely to cause trouble. Plus, it could reduce the need for even more intrusive surveillance methods.
So it's like a preventative measure almost, like a we're watching you so behave kind of thing. But does that even work? I mean, technology has gotten so advanced, it's not like the 1770s anymore, where a mask could actually keep you anonymous.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Hmm.
And it's something we'll definitely unpack. But before we get too deep into the tech tab, we got to talk about the history of these bans because it's not like they just popped up out of nowhere. They've been around for a while, like back to the 1840s in the U.S. First, they were targeting protesters, then the KKK, and now they're back in the spotlight. And what's crazy is how the language around them has evolved along with the technology.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Like, you've got figures like Nassau County Executive Bruce Blakeman saying, take your mask off, don't be a coward. Or New York Mayor Eric Adams using similar language, like calling masked protesters cowards.
Yeah.
It's not just about identification anymore, it's like a moral judgment almost.
Yeah, and that rhetoric has real-world consequences. The Wired article mentions this 26-year-old guy who got arrested in Nassau County just for wearing a keffiyeh, you know, that traditional scarf?
Yeah.
He was at a protest and boom, arrested. So it makes you wonder, are these bans really being applied fairly? Could they be used to target certain groups or stifle dissent?
It's kind of scary to think that even if you're not doing anything wrong, just covering your face could paint you as suspicious.
And then you have to consider people who wear masks for legitimate reasons, like protecting themselves from COVID or dealing with a medical condition. The CDC even recommends masking in certain situations. So it's like this clash between public health guidelines, individual rights, and law enforcement concerns. A real mess.
Yeah, a real mess. So we've got this historical baggage, strong opinions on both sides, and now the CDC's weighing in. But the big elephant in the room is the technology itself. I mean, we live in a world where police have facial recognition stingrays that track cell phones, even gait analysis to ID you by how you walk. Do mask bans even matter anymore?
That's what we're going to find out.
Seriously, it's like
Yeah.
every time you turn around, there's some new tech that knows where you are, what you're doing, who you're talking to. Geofence warns those things are nuts. Basically, they can just grab location data from any device in a certain area.
Right. And you've got those social media monitoring companies
Mm.
analyzing everything you post, trying to build a profile.
Creepy, right? And then there are those license plate readers. They're everywhere now. It's like Big Brother's got a whole toolkit these days.
Yeah, and you got to wonder if they already have all these tools, how much does banning masks actually help? Seems like they could probably figure out who you are, even with your face covered, especially if you're using a phone or driving.
That's what I'm thinking. The Wired article brought up this TikToker, Kristen Sodakun, goes by a NotCon Jr. online. She does these like consensual doxing demonstrations.
Oh yeah, I've seen her stuff. Pretty wild.
Yeah, she uses public info to find people's real names and birthdays, even if they're masked in their TikTok videos.
It's kind of scary how easy it is.
Right. Like her whole point is you don't need someone's face. You just need that one relative who overshares everything online.
And if she can figure it out, imagine what law enforcement with their even more advanced tools can do.
Yeah, they've got stuff like Clearview AI that can ID people even with partially obscured faces. It's kind of unsettling.
It is, and it makes you question the whole point of mask bans if they're not really the main obstacle to identification.
Like, if the tech is already so good at bypassing masks, what's the argument for the bans?
It's a tough question, and it kind of leads into this whole legal gray area around surveillance tech. The law is always playing catch up with technology, and privacy seems to be one of the biggest battlegrounds.
Yeah, like how do we define reasonable expectation of privacy these days? Especially when you've got cameras and sensors everywhere constantly collecting data. It's like, are we ever really in private anymore?
It's blurry, for sure. Rachel Harrells from the ACLU was quoted in the article, and she's concerned about this erosion of privacy. With all the cameras and algorithms out there, it's like we're constantly being monitored, whether we're at a protest or just walking down the street.
Yeah, it's a little creepy when you think about it. And legally speaking, are there any signs that the courts are starting to push back against all this surveillance?
There have been a few wins for privacy advocates. For example, a federal appeals court ruled that those geofence warrants are unconstitutional, said they violate our protection against unreasonable searches.
That's huge, right? But is that everywhere or just certain states?
It's limited to a few states for now, but it's a start. There was also this case in New York where a judge ruled against warrantless phone searches at border crossings like JFK Airport.
Interesting. So it seems like the courts are at least starting to think about the implications of all this surveillance tech.
Yeah, they're not just rubber stamping everything law enforcement wants anymore. And even some tech companies are pushing back. Google, for example, changed how they store location data to avoid complying with those geofence warrants.
It's good to see some resistance, but the Wired article also pointed out how hard it is to know when these technologies are even being used. Police departments are often super secretive about their methods, which makes it tough to hold them accountable.
Yeah, that lack of transparency is a big problem. If we don't know how these technologies are being used, how can we have a real conversation about their impact on our privacy and rights?
It's like playing a game where you don't know the rules and the ref is keeping score in secret.
Exactly, and it circles back to that big question. In this world where it's getting harder and harder to be anonymous, how do we rethink protest and dissent? How do we make our voices heard without putting ourselves at risk?
Man, it's like we went from 18th century tea parties to like full-on sci-fi surveillance. Kind of makes your head spin.
It's a lot to take in, but it shows just how much the digital age is changing the whole game when it comes to protests.
Like if we try to sum up everything, what are the big things that stand out for you?
Well, I think the main thing is that mask bans are just like one tiny part of this whole bigger story.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're supposed to deter crime, make it easier to ID lawbreakers, but when you've got all this tech that can already do that, their effectiveness is kind of questionable.
And you got to think about free speech, too. If people are worried about being identified, harassed, or even doxxed, they might not want to protest at all.
Right. It creates this chilling effect. Plus, you've got people who need to wear masks for health reasons, so these bans could actually be discriminatory. It's like, are they really helping or just making things worse?
Yeah, it's messy for sure. And the law is still trying to figure out how to deal with all this new tech. But
Yeah.
what I keep coming back to is this idea that maybe we need to rethink how we approach protest in this digital age. Like if hiding our faces isn't really an option anymore, what do we do?
That's the challenge, isn't it? But maybe instead of focusing on individual anonymity, we shift to more collective action. Like if we can't hide, maybe we find strength in numbers.
Kind of like safety in numbers, but instead of being in the shadows, you're out in the open,
Yeah.
showing that you're not going to be intimidated.
Exactly. And this is where technology gets interesting because it can be used for surveillance, but also to fight against it. There are groups working on privacy tools, encryption tactics to protect protesters and make it harder to track them.
So it's not all doom and gloom. There are ways to push back. But it also makes you think about the responsibility of tech companies and lawmakers. Like, do they have a role in making sure we have both security and individual rights in this world of constant surveillance?
Absolutely. Tech companies need to build privacy into their products and resist those government requests for data that can be used against us. They need to be more upfront about how they're collecting and using our info and give us more control over it.
And lawmakers need to step up too. Create laws that protect our privacy in the digital age. The old laws just don't cut it anymore. We need strong protections against government overreach and to make sure these technologies aren't being used to silence people or target certain groups.
Couldn't agree more. We got to have these conversations now because the choices we make today will determine what happens to privacy, free speech, even democracy in the future.
We've covered a lot of ground, but I feel like we've just scratched the surface. Any advice for our listener out there who's probably taking all this in and feeling a little overwhelmed?
First off, don't freak out. Being aware of these issues is a good thing. It's easy to feel powerless against all this, but we all have a role to play.
So what can our listeners do?
Start by asking questions. Don't just accept things at face value. Talk to people about this stuff, your friends, family, coworkers. Share what you've learned. And get involved. Contact your representatives, support organizations that are fighting for our digital rights.
It's like a reminder that we're not just along for the ride. We can actually do something to shape the future.
Exactly. The future isn't set in stone. It's something we create.
And that's what makes this deep dive so important. It's not just about knowing the facts. It's about empowering you to be an active and informed citizen.
Well said. So, to our listener out there, we hope this has gotten you thinking and maybe even inspired you to take action. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting for the world you want to live in. Because ultimately, it's up to all of us to shape the future.